Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk about individuals who should be in statue form in this age in which we are tearing down statues of Confederate leaders. Now, granted, I don't think there should be Confederate statues all over the place. I think that's a kick in the teeth to many people, African Americans and many others. I think of all the people who died fighting against the South. It is definitely a kick in the teeth against them. And it is definitely a kick in the teeth of those that were oppressed. And so while we tear down statues, not all of them, of course, but a vast bunch of them, because there's too many of them, let's think of some people that should be represented in a statue. Now, if I see another statue of Abraham Lincoln, I'm going to get ill. There are far too many statues of Lincoln. Now, Lincoln, we talk about freeing the slaves, and that sounds all well and good. But we have to remember that Lincoln was a very clever railroad attorney. He knew how to play with words. He knew how to take advantage of a political situation, and he certainly knew how to talk to people. You know, he threw religion into his speeches. So he starts sounding like a biblical prophet because he realized that this man's a God-fearing man, therefore he must have the nation in his heart. Well, we know that Lincoln was pretty good at telling a yarn. We also know that Lincoln could be a good bullshit artist, too. And a lot of the stuff that he did was very much that. He walked on eggshells. He did a lot of doublespeak. He never stood for anything too strongly. He always left a trap door open so he could escape. One has to remember that Lincoln was pushing very hard for the 13th Amendment in 1861. And what did that say? That was basically creating a constitutional amendment in which the institution of slavery cannot be touched. Wait a minute. Isn't the 13th Amendment about totally destroying slavery? Yes, it is. That's the 13th Amendment of 1865. But we forget the fact that Lincoln was behind the 13th Amendment of 1861, which was a total 180-degree different amendment. It didn't pass. Never made it. But think about that. Had it passed, Lincoln would have been the individual who made slavery a constitutional right. Yet we have statues of him all over the place. He's a politician and a good BS artist. We got to remember that. Now let's talk about somebody who had couillons, who actually stood up for something and wasn't afraid to stand up for something. And that was John Quincy Adams. There should be statues of John Quincy Adams all over the place. But there are none. You might find a few, maybe in Boston. But who was John Quincy Adams besides the 6th President of the United States? He was the son of one of the founders, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, John Adams. And you know, if you look at our presidents at the beginning of this nation, let's go through the first, 12? George Washington, slaves. John Adams, no slaves. Thomas Jefferson, slaves. James Madison, slaves. James Monroe, slaves. John Quincy Adams, no slaves. Andrew Jackson, slaves. Martin Van Buren had a few slaves. William Henry Harrison, slaves. John Tyler, slaves. James K. Polk, slaves. Zachary Taylor, slaves. That's the first 12 presidents. There's only 2 that didn't have slaves. John Adams and John Quincy Adams. And after being president from 1825 to 1829, John Quincy Adams left the presidency and took the lowly post of a congressman. And there he served for 17 terms. He was the man pretty much alone, the solitary voice for a long time against slavery. Do you realize they created the Gag Rule? In all of this talk about the Civil War and all of this talk about our history, who knows much about anything about the Gag Rule? We don't even talk about it. And the Gag Rule was simple. You don't talk about slavery in Congress. Everybody followed it. Except John Quincy Adams. He fought a solitary battle against the Gag Rule. And eventually, after being censured, after being threatened with expulsion, after receiving constant assassination threats, he defeated the Gag Rule in 1844. Took years. This is the man who lit the match that would start the American Civil War. This is the man that lit the match to start this whole idea of the freedom of the slaves. This is the man who represented the Amistad slaves and gained them their freedom. Where are the statues to this man who did so much? I get so annoyed. Because you know something? John Quincy Adams led and wrote the path to follow on how to free the slaves. He said, use the War Powers Act. That's exactly what Abraham Lincoln would do. The path for Lincoln had been cleared, partially, by John Quincy Adams. Yet, not a soul wants to mention anything about our dear friend John Quincy Adams. There was the movie Amistad that came out, and he was the individual of the freedom, but people don't know who he is. Shouldn't there be statues all over? Shouldn't there be great moments in Black History Month in February where they talk about John Quincy Adams? Not a word. So while we're tearing down statues of Stonewall Jackson and various other people that fought with the South to preserve their peculiar institution, maybe we should bypass another damn statue of Lincoln, which there are too many of, and put a few statues up of John Quincy Adams. I don't want to take too much away from Lincoln, because Lincoln did a lot. Lincoln was a very clever attorney. He was great at doublespeak, and he did a good job at it. The Proclamation of Emancipation, War Powers Act. He freed the slaves in the South. He had no control over the slaves in the South. But what he promised in the Proclamation of Emancipation is that the slaves in the border states and the North, they remained slaves until 1865. That is what is called double talk. And that's what Lincoln was good at. But few people had the nerve, had the guts, and had the determination and the moral fortitude to fight like John Quincy Adams did. We call him Old Man Eloquent. I went to his grave. He's entombed in Quincy, Massachusetts. I walked in and I just said 2 words. Thank you. That's all that needed to be said.